God is the most. Your relationship with Him means most to you. You get that by the atonement. About me, my ideas about PS are completely original. I've always have not read or listened to anything against PS. Before I could drive, I spent a lot of time trying to reconcile PS with the Bible. Imagine your pastor blaspheming God every week from the pulpit. That's how I feel. Blasphemy equals saying evil of God. Evil equals hurt one's own. God hurts his own. Those outside of PS and looking into PS see a problem with PS. To them, it appears that God contradicts his own. Those people don't find such contradictions in whatever they themselves have known about the atonement because their theories are different from PS. Of course, PS resolves those perceived contradictions, but only for those within the PS domain. And so it is that when PS speaks a certain generality, not being mindful of non-pen subs, that pen subs mix two very different things in the eyes than non-pen sub. They mix how Jesus is treated by God or else sinners. We'll get into this soon. For example, a famous PS thinker, R.C. Sproul, could see where PS leads at the end of his preaching to a big crowd at the 2008 Big Ether for the Gospel Conference, that what was pure, Jesus was pure no more. God cursed and damned his son. What the hell we deserve. I call this the ultimate blasphemy, aka sound doctrine. Could there possibly be any phrase in English more evil? None is higher than God, and nothing's more precious to him than his son. And damnation is the worst thing he could possibly do. Speaking of the drama of God's justice and mercy fighting like Greek God, Luther admitted in his popular commentary where PS leads, Christ should become the greatest transgressor, of all sinners the greatest, and is now not an innocent person and without sin, but not now the Son of God, born of the Virgin Mary, but a sinner which hath and carrieth the sin of Paul. Trusting God means attributing all good to him, but they jargon contradictions they can't mean. You know that Satan would use something this extreme to photobomb the gospel. What's penalty substitution atonement theory? Penalty substitution atonement theory doesn't mean Jesus died for us. It's much more specific. So if that's all you want, do not promote PS. It's not the gospel that God sent his son to die and rise. If you think that PS owns the atonement, you're mistaken or proud. But PS is not proud for finding his own place in the atonement. What is really being asked? What's different about PS? A package. PS is about a package which transforms into his dying. It's not his spotless blood nor our forgiveness, but a place between the two. Our forgiveness, but a place between the two. It's a package of wrath which God exhausts for Jesus to absorb. The package essentially is the hell that each and every one of us would have hypothetically got within PS had we died without Christ. That's why this theory was named penalty substitution. Any view without that indispensable package is not PS. Any view with that package is at least a kind of PS. Defining passive sinner and Christ's guilt is most important only to pen subs. Non-peb subs don't care about that. It's not something that can be zealously hated outside of PS. But the thing that's most hated about PS from outside of PS is the PS. I am talking about the core central package of our hells. From the outside, PS seems to turn God into a pendulum. To appreciate PS, you first have to come into it. I mean, your heart must need it. Once you become a pensup, then that pendulum swing at the center of PS might be your most beloved part about PS. Why? Because it allows God to give and take in your mind, while others outside of PS can only perceive God and his cross as sheer giving. Non-PS don't want to wrap God into a dumb little box or else give the glory that God deserves to this random little theory. Again, PS needs not to debate with non-PS about Christ's sinfulness. That distracts from the issue. Like the devil, we already agree about Christ being perfect. No matter how you label it, moving on. PS simply, as a framework, is a circular satisfaction theory. That is, which primarily solves the problem it creates. Naturally, Bible doctrines don't depend on such a theory of this shape. But this theory may depend on some Bible doctrine. God possesses the glory and honor of forgiveness. PS asks to answer where he get that. Now, others' theories say that God doesn't count sin, while PS adds God doesn't count paid sin. God wouldn't forgive anything not paid within PS. That kind of forgiveness is not in God. The non-PS say the same thing, but don't know it. The non-PS don't realize that they think PS forgiveness is the only thing worth calling forgiveness. On top of that, non-PS would consider forgiveness without PS to not even be forgiveness. Unlike PS, non-PS thinks the only thing that God gets out of the believer's sin is his own forgiveness, which isn't necessarily a good feeling. And hopefully we can appreciate not burning. So far, we've touched on pen subs mixing carelessly a couple extremely different ideas, their own with the Bible itself. And also we've observed non-PS blindly mixing something substantial, the definition of forgiveness. It seems that everybody assumes things. PS doesn't say that forgiveness is payment, but rather that forgiveness is sins being paid. Everyone knows that God would contradict himself to tolerate sin. PS says that although removing sin is not tolerating sin, removing sin without first paying the PS package is tolerating sin. PS and non-PS differ in what they value. PS values perfection in God. So pen subs expend their effort on how God could possibly deal with sin, whereas those against PS think that God doesn't have to deal with sin because whatever he forgets can't exist without him. It doesn't matter how bad. So it's almost funny how PS tried to help non-PS. It's like a very young boy picking out a tractor for his sister who was more interested in dolls. It said mature. Outside PS, God only goes forward, only positive, only yes, only strength and only amen. The only steps that God takes are virtuous, forgiving, glorious, and honorable. Non-PS assume that PS is a step back instead of forward. Non-PS assumes that PS committed dishonor. This dishonor is not about Christ being good or bad. The dishonor is not in God contradicting himself. This dishonor is not in the apparent consequences of blasphemy. So pen subs can't justify PS to non-PS by proving that God isn't contradicted within PS. That would only work for fellow pen subs. So now the dishonor is PS at its core. It's God moving backwards. We know he doesn't really do that. His forgiveness is forward moving as the PS package is paid. Any backwards movement which pen subs carelessly mix among themselves must be translated to forward movement outside of PS. The problem then is mistranslation. You could say God invented PS not to be used the way that pen subs try to use it. You must translate properly when you take a piece of information from within PS to outside of the PS domain. Non-PS hate PS outside of PS, and pen subs should too. It would be bad for God to go back and forth, but inside PS, God can go back and forth. He needs to. Pen subs feel that God must get some return for his glory. Where can they perch such a feeling? They can only imagine a forgiving God if he tolerates sin. They can't get discerned between forgiveness and toleration. Therefore, it's better for them to use the safety net of PS, meaning if God must take a step back, it's only because of himself. PS is a place for those who can't yet rest in God's limitlessness, a place where they can still find rest without unfoundedly worrying about endlessness being bigger than God. Outside of the PS mode, sins are never paid back, but that's too big of a thought for some. John MacArthur was asked to prove the existence of PS. His answer seemed to be that since PS requires the PS payment, PS must exist in order to pay the payment which it asks for. The circular framework which PS theory uses naturally designs its own rules, while also justifying its existence by its usefulness outside of itself. This is a common structure. PS carries PS carries immunity to external criticism. Again, the only way to criticize things inside of this type of theory is from within. Of course, you could use completely external criticism against it, like, for example, on the basis of it not being useful enough as a tool. Since only PS fulfills PS, it can't be satisfied without itself, so it demands its own existence. Additionally, it'd be dishonest to consider the lens of PS as an absolute truth. At best, it may be a possible absolute truth. Still, it's definitely a relative truth because of its independent passive framework. I mean, it's only truth in as much as it's true. On the outside, PS revolves as a water wheel by the inherently glorious water of forgiveness. And from within, the PS package fuels God's forgiveness. But the fuel doesn't do the forgiving for him. It's just a way to see things. For example, you could use a very mean mode of words to communicate something nice. So although PS doesn't allow forgiveness without a wrath package, we can be forgiven without a wrath package in other atonement theories, which lack that requirement. Until our contradictions against him are removed, which would happen after the PS package, God would contradict himself to join us. He'd never do that. Contradictions must be stripped from us before we can join God. Such truths are not PS, but PS stands on those truths. Also, in the PS dimension, the PS package is also freely given to God, by God, for God, to be able to remove sins. Dimension means measurement. PS measures the measureless God. It bisects the undivided God. I mean, it goes where no theory has gone before. PS is unique. It's not new. The PS dimension gives us a place to explain what we can't observe. It goes behind the scenes to explain how God forgive. Only PS explores certain parts not explicitly mentioned in the Bible. A spiritual mystery of the inner frustration behind the glory of forgiveness is what God might look like with a machine spirit. I mean, PS is like an analog signal converting to a digital. PS has to use digital signals because it's outside the range of analog signals. In this world, any framework, including PS, is going to have to relate, both within and without. I mean, it's going to have to relate with his own members, as well as other frameworks completely outside of itself. And a part within one framework doesn't always translate smoothly into other frameworks. As an example, I'm thinking of the friction between PS and non-PS people. People raised solely in PS can have a difficult time seeing past it. Nonetheless, PS, only within itself, correctly considers the payment to be necessary. They say, God won't remove a sin until paid. At the same time, to relate to those, the PS should discern the following common ground, because non-PS see no payment, but instead a mixture between what Jesus experiences from God or else from sinners. The PS package doesn't remove sins. Instead, God does it, and he does it for free. The PS payment doesn't directly remove sins. God removes our sins freely without the payment. The payment is not the same as removing our sins. God's forgiveness of us is different from his PS package. A sinner whose hell has been fully paid off within PS hypothetically still requires forgiveness as well. God logically removes our wrongs after PS package and practically removes them at the same time. Whether or not sins can be paid or if the pay was a PS, we remain a contradiction to God until he also removes our sin. Must we split the payment and removal of sins? Why not mix? The splits seem as there already. So the question is, how helpful would it be for us to pay attention to it? And then the answer is, yes, helpful, because of other frameworks. We live in a world of more than one way to look at things. This will help you communicate and synergize for advantages both within and without the PS framework. It's better to let other atonement frameworks command God's sin removal so that PS can be more in demand of its own package and keep it pure. Other theories, which were not designed to handle the PS package, can't value the package like PS does. But all biblical theories should agree with the Bible's sin removal. So use this split to prevent fights with other framework. But of course, if everyone you're around is firmly PS, then you might as well ignore the seam between the sin payment and removal. Have a little fun with fiction. We'll create 2 fictional verses to see what the PS package is about. Pen sub 1:1, Christ's death and our hells are basically in the relationship of payment and fee. Verse 2, without this payment, there's no forgiveness of sins. So verse 1 is a pattern not found in the Bible explicitly, and verse 2 adds a middle step, a fee between the payment and the forgiveness. The schism. The greatest schism within PS is about whether the PS package should include guilt. Those who accept a guilty payment must then determine which way he was guilty. So we have number 1, Jesus as a first-party penalty substitute, or number 2 as a third-party penalty substitute. Antagonism being key to critical examination, I'll use antagonist Joe to push poor Peter away from being a first-party pen sub to a third-party pen sub. I hate pen sub. Well, I love it. No matter how willing or lonely, Joe says, God would not contradict himself by contradicting one of his own, nor would he get honor from any other source. Peter says, okay, so instead of God punishing his son, he disowns his son first, inasmuch as Jesus in the flesh doesn't belong to God. Even in those ways and to those degrees, God could contradict him. God needs not repay somewhat he disowned. But God would have to repay Jesus for any other contradictions outside of being guilty. Notice that first party PS doesn't consider God disowning his son, in some ways, to be any contradiction. To them, Jesus doesn't become a PS in every way, but only in necessary ways. Jesus was dying righteous, or Jesus was dying somewhat guilty. Both are penalty substitutes. No other atonement theory outside of PS has Jesus' death as even a third-party payment for our hells. This issue is only within PS, and it's important. You can get some fights out of it. So here's another amusing argument for you to get the drift of both major PS sects. Billy, you're not even worthy to be called a pen sub. What kind of substitution is a third-party agreement? Peter says, I'm a pen sub by virtue of the wrath package, and anyone that agrees that Jesus subs for a hypothetical wrath is a full-fledged pen sub. You're the one with the problem because you think Christ was guilty, Billy. Christ was guilty. That should be inseparable from the wrath package. It's so random that just our pain should fall on Christ. Actually, everything about our hypothetical hell was included, even our guilt. Guilt isn't everything either, says Peter. Billy says, but it's closer to everything than you, Peter. Even if our hypothetical pain and guilt were everything, all of that is still translate into his death, or possibly worse. And so because of translation, the guilt would carry over no more than some pain on the cross. Secondly, his honor seems to spare him from suffering endlessly, but where there's guilt, there's no honor. Whatever is guilty about him would end up suffering endlessly, as we would have, and we don't see that. He must have retained his honor and not guilt. Thirdly, guilt would mean nothing anyway, since it's passive to him. Another issue that only people within PS care about is what kind of suffering might have been included in the PS package. Was it the physical sufferings recorded in the Bible alone, or were there extra, even supernatural, above our understanding suffering? A debate about this would put the audience to sleep. And before you fall asleep, I'll notch up the antagonism. Pen subs have their same 20 lines. For example, you'll just have to trust God, meaning God's trustworthiness is reason for you to believe them. Or else they'll say that it's not possible for God to be just unless they're right. I guess you've memorized their repetitions of incubated seminary jargon. Pen subs love God, and that's why they defend their enemy. P.S. They think PS to be a close friend. How can I tell someone that they're being betrayed by a close friend? They want to explain it away before they see the problem, and so they keep the problem.